At the age of 32, Mark Twain was shown something that would change his life forever. The year was 1867. He was on a 5-month cruise to Europe and the Holy Land with a group of adventurous American tourists aboard a retired Civil War battleship. It was a miniature portrait of a young woman painted on ivory, the sister of fellow passenger Charlie Langdon, son of a wealthy New York businessman. Twain was smitten, in love at first sight. All he had to do now was persuade her to fall in love with him. Welcome to Insane History. I'm Professor Graeme Yorston, and today we're continuing our exploration of the life of Mark Twain, one of America's most colourful characters and one of the world's greatest writers. This video will cover the second half of his life. If you want to set the scene by hearing about his childhood in small-town Missouri, his youthful wanderings as a printer and Mississippi steamboat pilot, and his wild adventures out west, then please check out my video on his early years. But if you want to go charging into the second half of his life, with all the carefree abandon so characteristic of Twain himself, then let's go. After returning to America, Twain was invited by Charlie to dine with the Langdon family at their hotel. A few days later, on New Year's Day 1868, he called in again. Normal decorum would have dictated a polite chat about the weather for a few minutes, but Twain stayed for 12 hours. Over the next year, he put all his energy into courting Olivia. She was not too keen at first, and she rejected his first marriage proposal. After all, he was poor, he had not stuck at any trade for very long, and his first book had not been a success. But he persisted, wrote to her almost daily, started going to church regularly, refined his manners, and gave up drinking, and eventually he won her over with his charm and infectious enthusiasm, and they announced their engagement in February 1869. This may have been helped by the appearance of his second book, The Innocents Abroad, which chronicled his recent travels in the kingdoms and empires of Europe. It was an immediate success, selling over 70,000 copies in its first year, and it remained the best-selling of his works during his lifetime. The couple married a year later in Olivia's hometown of Elmira, New York. Her father was a successful coal merchant, and the Langdons were one of the leading families of the community, known for their progressive views. Her father had participated in the Underground Railroad, helping slaves escape to the North before the Civil War, and the family was close to Harriet Beecher Stowe, Frederick Douglass, and William Dean Howells. Olivia's mother was also known for her reformist opinions and was actively involved in charities and a long-time supporter of abolition, temperance, and women's suffrage. Their daughter, Olivia, or Livy as she was always known, was raised in an intellectually stimulating and liberal environment, and after they were married, Twain always discussed his work with her and adopted most of her suggestions, saying, "I take as much pride in her brains as I do in her beauty." Her health was never the best, however. In her teens, she spent 2 years being treated for a back problem in the Institute of Swedish Movement Cure in New York City, and has been endless speculation by historians as to whether she had a physical disorder, Pott's disease or tuberculosis of the spine, or a psychological problem, neurasthenia, neurosis, and hysteria, all having been suggested as possible explanations. After the wedding, they lived in Buffalo, New York. Livy's father, Jervis, bought them a grand house and a 1/3 interest in the Buffalo Express newspaper for Twain to work as an editor and writer. But not long after they began their new life there, Jervis was diagnosed with inoperable stomach cancer, and they returned to Elmira to help look after him. His slow, painful death drained the entire family, especially Livy, who was already pregnant with her first child. When they returned to Buffalo, Livy was exhausted and needed constant care. Her childhood friend Emma Nye came to stay to help cheer her up, but within days of arriving, Nye contracted typhoid fever and died. Livy almost miscarried and was confined to bed, and their firstborn child and only son, Langdon, was born prematurely in November 1870. He weighed only 4.5 pounds and remained frail and sickly. When the baby was only 3 months old, Livy also contracted typhoid fever and almost died while Twain was away on business. On his return, the house was in chaos. Livy was completely incapacitated, the baby cried incessantly, and medical bills were piling up. Twain had to do something. He sold his share in the Buffalo Express, put their house on the market, and packed everyone off to Elmira. He later described their time in Buffalo as among the blackest, gloomiest, and the most wretched of my long life. Back in her childhood home, Livy's and Langdon's health slowly improved, and a few days before their second anniversary, the family moved 300 miles to Hartford, Connecticut, next door to Harriet Beecher Stowe. The proofs for Twain's latest book about his adventures on the wild frontier, Roughing It, were ready. He had a successful lecture tour, and Langdon seemed to be growing stronger every day. Very fat and chubby, and always cheerful and happy-hearted. And Livy was expecting again. His book appeared to favourable reviews and strong sales, and their daughter, Olivia Susan, always known as Susie, was born. But then, tragedy. Langdon, at only 19 months of age, contracted diphtheria and died. Barely able to contain their grief, they were unable to accompany his body to Elmira for burial, travelling instead to a seaside resort to try and find some peace and recover. Livy barely left their room, but Twain threw himself into all the activities on offer, bowling, billiards, and entertaining guests in the evening with his tales. But I don't think this was due to selfishness or lack of emotion on his part. People have different ways of dealing with grief. For some, isolation and tears help heal the wounds. For others, busying themselves in work and social activities is the way. There is no right or wrong. While staying at the hotel, he decided he needed to go to England, ostensibly to secure British copyrights on his writings, and research a new book, a planned sequel to The Innocents Abroad, about the strange habits and customs of the Brits. But in the end, he didn't get much work done, and it seems likely that he just needed a break from the stresses of family life after 2 difficult years. He remained in London for 3 months, being wined and dined by the city's literati, lecturing and seeing the sights. The British public and press couldn't get enough of him, and Twain developed an enduring fondness for the old country. But eventually, Livy asked him to come home, in no uncertain terms, and he returned to Hartford. The following year, there was another trip to Britain, this time with Livy and Susie, and as part of the lecture tour, they visited Edinburgh. Shortly after arriving in Scotland's capital, however, Livy became unwell. Twain knew of a Dr. John Brown, who had written a book about a dog, and knowing no one else in the city, approached him and asked for help treating Livy. Brown looked after Livy and 17-month-old Susie while Twain continued on his lecture tour in London, and it was the start of a long-lasting friendship. On their return to Hartford, Susie was growing fast and becoming quite precocious, with her father commenting that even as a small child she had big thoughts. So far, Twain was known as a travel writer, but he now began working on a novel with his friend Charles Dudley Warner, a witty and satirical tale about political and financial corruption and the American obsession with getting rich. The Gilded Age appeared in 1873 and was well received. He enjoyed his first foray into long fiction and immediately embarked on another, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, whilst at the same time starting his reminiscences about his days as a riverboat pilot. A second daughter, Clara, was born in June 1874, and the expanding family moved into the vast new 25-room house they had had built in the Nook Farm neighbourhood of Hartford, Connecticut, enclave of writers, thinkers and social reformers. Old Times on the Mississippi appeared in the Atlantic in instalments in 1875, and in book form the following year. Everything seemed to be going well. He had a comfortable new home, a loving wife, 2 healthy daughters, his books were selling well, and he was a popular attraction on the lecture circuit. His fortunes had definitely improved. Even one of his inventions, the self-pasting scrapbook, was making him money. Over the next 17 years in Hartford and summers spent at Livy's sister's house at Quarry Farm in Elmira, he would write most of his classic novels. His nostalgic reminiscences in Tom Sawyer recall simpler times, already just a memory by the 1870s, and he called the book a hymn to childhood. It was an instant success, selling well from its first publication in 1876. 2 years later, he embarked on another trip to Europe, this time to Germany, Switzerland and Italy, and ending up in Rome. The plan was to walk most of the way with his friend Joseph Twitchell, the minister who officiated at his wedding, and, many years later, his funeral. Although the plan didn't last long, and they ended up using every mode of transport available. On his visit to the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, home to some of the world's greatest paintings, he was perturbed by one of its masterpieces, the Venus of Urbino by Titian. And there, against the wall, without obstructing rag or leaf, you may look your fill upon the foulest, the vilest, the obscenest picture the world possesses, Titian's Venus. It isn't that she is naked and stretched out on a bed, no, it is the attitude of one of her arms and hand. If I ventured to describe that attitude, there would be a fine howl. But there the Venus lies for anyone to gloat over that wants to. Scholars have long debated whether this was mock outrage or not. But his notebook points to his sentiments being genuine, and it's consistent with his rather prudish Victorian attitudes towards women and sexuality. His account of his second European trip was published as A Tramp Abroad in 1880. The book also contains some unrelated stories and a number of essays, including The Awful German Language, a version of which he later delivered in German to a rather bemused audience in Vienna. If, like me, you struggle to get your head around German grammar at school, it still rings true, and it's full of Twain's trademark witticisms. In Germany, a lady has no sex, while a turnip has. Also in 1880, his youngest daughter Jane, always known as Jean, was born. Twain wrote to his sister, "Jean is as fat as a watermelon, and just as sweet and good, and often just as wet." All 3 Clemens girls were taught at home, initially by their mother and later by tutors and governesses. Notwithstanding his views on the German language, Twain wanted them to learn another language before English, his reason being that they would learn English no matter what, and it would be easier for them to pick up other languages while they were young. So a German nurse was employed who always spoke to them in her grammatically correct mother tongue. The Prince and the Pauper appeared in 1881, dedicated to his daughters. He had read extensively about English and French history on his European travels, and the book represents his first attempt at historical fiction. And whilst it was ostensibly written for children, as always with Twain, the book is a subtle critique of social inequality and the judging of others merely by their appearance. It was well received, critics regarding it as a new departure from his previous writing as a humorist, a worthy work of fiction, and according to some, of philosophy. Next came Life on the Mississippi, which was published in 1883. It is an expanded version of his earlier work, Old Times on the Mississippi, and recounts his days working on the steamboats as a young man, and more recent trips on the river to his hometown of Hannibal. He describes the changing landscape and expanding cities, and adds his observations on human greed, gullibility, tragedy, and bad architecture, along with a few of his famous tall stories. Adventures of Huckleberry Finn was published in 1884. Huck first appeared as a character in Tom Sawyer, and Twain began writing his story immediately after Sawyer was published in 1876. But poor old Huck had a very long gestation, as Twain often set the manuscript aside for long periods to work on other projects. It is one of the first American novels to be written in the vernacular, or ordinary everyday speech, and this led to it being harshly criticised and banned from many libraries. Concord, Massachusetts was fairly typical in its comments. The Public Library Committee has decided to exclude Mark Twain's latest book from the library. One member of the committee says that whilst he does not wish to call it immoral, he thinks it contains but little humour, and that of a very coarse type. He regards it as the veriest trash. The library and other members of the committee entertain similar views, characterising it as rough, coarse and inelegant, dealing with a series of experiences not elevating, the whole book being more suited to the slums than to intelligent, respectable people. And the writer of Little Women, Louisa May Alcott, wrote that if Twain could not think of something better to tell our pure-minded lads and lasses, he had best stop writing for them. In his defence, Twain said that he wrote both Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn for adults, not children, and that he was distressed to hear that youngsters had been allowed access to them. I recently watched a 4-hour PBS version of Huckleberry Finn, and was surprised at how dark some of its themes were. Definitely not the kid's story I'd always thought of it as. Child cruelty, alcoholism, murder and dead bodies, as well as the complex issues around Jim's precarious status as an escaped slave. Goodness me! Huck's father even tries to kill him while going through the delirium tremens of alcohol withdrawal. It's not an easy book, but I was saddened to learn that once again Huckleberry Finn has been banned in some schools. I understand the reasons, of course, but I think that simply trying to avoid uncomfortable episodes in human history does nobody any good. It was the first book released by Twain's own publishing firm, established with his nephew, the Charles L. Webster Company, which he set up in the hope of retaining control over his writing, as well as getting a larger share of the profits. The company wasn't exclusively for his own work, it also published the memoirs of his Civil War almost adversary, Ulysses S. Grant, to great acclaim and financial success. To publicise Huckleberry Finn, Twain embarked on a 4-month, 80-city tour with George Washington Cable, writing to his wife that it went a-booming. His next book, which appeared in 1889, was another radical new departure. A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court is about a workman from a 19th century New England arms factory who wakes up after being struck on the head to find himself among the knights and wizards of King Arthur's Camelot. The overconfident Yankee of the title believes he will be in charge of the whole country inside 3 weeks and launches an ambitious modernisation plan making full use of his knowledge of armaments. But it doesn't quite go according to plan. It may not sound all that radical now, but it was very new in 1889, and was of course another opportunity for Twain to comment on and critique the modern world and all the things he disliked about it. And whilst it is still great fun, the darker tones of his later works are beginning to surface in this novel. But for all his nostalgic looking backwards, Twain had a genuine love for technology and new inventions. We've already heard about his self-pasting scrapbook, of which 25,000 were sold, and he had 2 other patents, an improvement in adjustable and detachable straps for garments, which he proposed for gentlemen's clothing. It may never have caught on for men, but his clasp continues to hold together billions of brassieres around the world to this day. He also invented a memory-building game, which was less successful. He was also an early adopter of the inventions of others. This is the letter he wrote to his brother on a new-fangled typewriter. and he is known to have made several voice recordings, although none have survived. The closest we have is actor William Gillette's impersonation of him. Gillette was a talented mimic and a close friend of Twain, so it is probably quite accurate.
Well, there was a man around here in the spring of '49 named Jim.
Twain was fascinated by the work of Nikola Tesla and was a frequent visitor to his laboratory, where he took part in experiments and became a close friend, even inviting him to his daughter's wedding. There is a story that Tesla encouraged him to have a go on his oscillating machine after he complained of constipation, but he stayed on too long, with rather disastrous consequences for his famous white linen suit. For some reason, he also fancied himself as a bit of an investor, but he really shouldn't have. He lost money on an engraving process, on a magnetic telegraph, on a steam pulley, on the Fredonia Watch Company, and on railroad stocks, but his ultimate downfall was the Page Compositor, a mechanical typesetting machine. As a former printer himself, Twain could see the enormous promise of being able to set type automatically, and he began investing in James W. Page's invention at the beginning of the 1880s. Not too much at first, but as the machine grew in complexity, it sucked in more and more of his cash. In the end, Twain threw around $10 million in today's terms into a business that only ever sold 3 of its 4-ton, 180,000 moving part behemoths before it was rendered obsolete by the German linotype machine. In 1890, Twain's mother died, followed a month later by Livy's mother, and at the same time Jean, who had just turned 10, was also seriously unwell. He wrote to his friend William Dean Howells, "I have fed so full on sorrows these last weeks that I seem to have become hardened to them, benumbed." The previous decade had brought great success and financial rewards, but his investments had not. Most of the profits from his writing, and a large chunk of his wife's substantial inheritance, had gone down the drain. Twain had always been addicted to risk, as a child, as a young man, and as a mature family man. "I must speculate in something. Such is my nature," he said. Only later, much wiser and poorer, did he admit, there are 2 times in a man's life when he should not speculate: when he can't afford it, and when he can. The early 1890s saw the income from his book sales start to drop off, and his publishing company struggled in the general economic downturn. So in June 1891, in an effort to reduce their outgoings, the Clemens family closed up their expensive Hartford home and set out for Europe, funded by the New York Sun on the promise of regular letters about their travels. They stayed mainly in France, Germany and Italy, and because of Livy, Susie's and Jean's poor health, they spent a lot of time sampling the waters at various health spas over the next 4 years, with Twain popping back occasionally to New York to deal with business. In 1892, he published his least well-known novel, The American Claimant, but slow sales didn't help his finances or the viability of his publishing company. He needed a saviour. The following year, he met Henry H. Rogers, a self-made multimillionaire and oil tycoon, known for his ruthlessness in business, which earned him the nickname Hellhound Rogers, but also his wit and cultured sophistication. Rogers was a long-time fan of Twain's writing and advised him to transfer his assets, including the copyrights on his books, to his wife, and then file for bankruptcy. He owed about $80,000, around $2.4 million today, to authors, bookbinders, and the Mount Morris Bank. And his asset shift was controversial to say the least, with accusations of fraud being freely bandied about. In the same year, 2 new novels appeared, Tom Sawyer Abroad and Pudd'nhead Wilson, which gently satirises everything from small-town politics to the fear of new technology. It also returns to one of his major recurring themes, the evils of slavery. and has the distinction of being one of the first novels to include the strange new science of fingerprinting as a key plot element. Twain did not simply walk away from his creditors, as he was legally entitled to do. Instead, he set out on a year-long around-the-world lecture tour with Livy and his two youngest daughters in July 1895, with Rogers keeping careful tabs on everything they spent. It was a long and at times arduous journey. Twain was often ill with everything from colds to carbuncles. He started in Canada, then sailed across the Pacific to Fiji, Australia, New Zealand, Sri Lanka and India. He loved India, and his 3 months there became the focus of his 700-page book, Following the Equator. Then it was on to Mauritius and South Africa, and finally back to England 14 months and 150 lectures later. Acclaimed everywhere he went, the tour was a huge success. But while he was away, his eldest daughter Susie died suddenly at the age of 24. She was perhaps Twain's favourite, in many ways a second muse, with whom he could discuss anything, and with creative aspirations of her own. She had stayed behind at her aunt's house in Elmira, while her parents and sisters circumnavigated the globe to focus on singing. On a trip to the family home in Hartford, she developed a fever and rapidly became delirious. It was meningitis, almost invariably fatal in the 19th century, and the inevitable occurred. Grief-stricken, her parents never returned to Hartford to live, and Twain fell into a period of deep depression. In her 1931 memoir, My Father, Mark Twain, Clara recalled this difficult period, saying that no one in the family smiled for a long time. And just before Susie's death, their youngest daughter Jean, at the age of 15, had started having epileptic seizures. The best doctors in England, Sweden, Germany and Switzerland were consulted, but there was no cure. Just advice to keep her calm. Not easy when they were constantly on the move. Jean would have spells of frequent grand mal seizures when her mother would stay with her day and night, followed by better periods with fewer attacks. The stress of caring for Jean didn't help Livy's own health, not least because of the stigma surrounding epilepsy at this time, and Livy's efforts to include Jean in as many family and social activities as possible. One time, Twain tried to explain his daughter's condition to Rogers, saying her head got a bad knock when she was 8 or 9, and in her teens she started showing capricious changes of disposition which we could not account for. Brain injury was recognised as a cause of epilepsy and was a more acceptable explanation than it being familial, as at the time epilepsy was very much viewed in terms of degeneration theory, that intoxication and criminality in one generation would lead to mental illness and epilepsy in the next. Somehow Twain managed to carry on writing to pay off the debts, publishing Tom Sawyer Detective in 1896, a send-up of the immensely popular murder mystery novels of the time. Over the next few years, the family lived a somewhat nomadic existence, mostly in England and then Austria, where Clara studied the piano under the famous teacher Theodor Leschetizky in Vienna. Back in London in 1899, Twain met Dr. Henrik Kellgren, a Swedish gymnastics and massage physician who persuaded the family to spend the summer at his sanatorium in Sweden to help Jean's illness. And however he was feeling about life, he still had to perform. He had to be clever, witty, the irrepressible American Mark Twain. A job he accomplished seemingly without effort. When he was elected an honorary member of the Savage Club in London, he was told that only 3 men had been so honoured, including the Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VII. He replied, "Well, it must make the Prince feel mighty fine." But behind closed doors, Twain acknowledged the toll this difficult period had on the entire family, describing it as 5 years of constant anxiety with periodical shocks and frights. But the coffers were refilled and he was able to return to America in 1900, having earned enough to pay off his debts. On his travels, Twain witnessed the human costs of European imperialism in India, South Africa and the Pacific, and he was vehemently opposed to America's involvement in the Philippines and Caribbean after the Spanish-American War of 1898. His outspoken writings and speeches on the topic were not always well received, and after his return some even accused him of being a traitor. His writing turned darker, focusing increasingly on greed and cruelty, and at times he questioned the very humanity of the human race. Fears that his reputation and popular appeal might be damaged led to him not publishing some of these later works during his lifetime. In 1902, Livy suffered what was probably a heart attack, and her health continued to deteriorate. And the following year, after 3 years living in New York, the family set out for Florence, where they thought the warm Italian sun would improve her health. Twain had to stay away from her in her final months, as she was under doctor's orders to be kept quiet and to avoid excitement. He sent her little love notes twice a day and occasionally broke the rules to sit with her. But Clara made sure that no news of Jean's illness was shared with her, and Jean, in turn, was not informed about her mother's failing health. In June 1904, Livy died. Twain had depended on her for so long he didn't know what to do. He was simply unable to take part in everyday life, to travel, or to write. He returned to New York and slowly picked himself up and found the strength to carry on. He began working on his memoirs, incorporating the touching biography of him written by his daughter Susie when she was 13. But perhaps the strangest part of his life also began around this time, when, in his 70s, he started showing an interest in young girls. One of the first was 15-year-old Gertrude Natkin, whom he met leaving a recital at Carnegie Hall in December 1905. She wrote to him signing off as "Your obedient child," and ended her note, "I am the little girl who loves you." He responded immediately, and then began a flirtatious correspondence, sometimes calling her Marjorie, after Marjorie Fleming, a precocious Scottish child poet who died at the age of 8, but also his little witch, and she called him Darling. Their correspondence ended abruptly, however, when she reached 16, at which point he turned his attention to younger girls. He did remain in the adult world for part of the time, however, and after the San Francisco earthquake of 1906, he heard that his friend and possible old flame, Ina Coolbrith, had lost nearly all that she owned, so he sent her some signed photographs to sell. He also started dictating his autobiography to his secretary as he wandered around his house, not in any sort of chronological order, but leaping from topic to topic and going off on tangents. It was a task he had started many times previously, but abandoned. This time he persisted with it and published some chapters in the North American Review, but most of his unstructured musings and anecdotes remained in manuscript form, with limited access granted to select scholars until 2010, 100 years after his passing, when a monumental 3-volume, 2,000-page set was published. In 1906, Twain's secretary, Isabel Lyon, claimed that his youngest daughter, Jean, had physically attacked the maid, saying that she wanted to kill her, and more than once. Reluctantly, Twain arranged for her to be sent to an epilepsy colony in Katona, New York. Jean was unhappy there, and wrote to her father begging to be allowed to return home. But he wasn't sure he could look after her safely. Her mother's death had affected her badly, and she was having clusters of seizures, up to 3 a day. And at the time, fears of people committing violent crimes during epileptic attacks were common, so his fears were understandable. However, historian Karen Lystra, in her biography, suggests that Lyon manipulated the separation between father and daughter to get closer to Twain, as Lyon hoped to marry him and get her hands on his money. Around the same time, he also began an acquaintance with writer Charlotte Teller, which some have suggested may have had romantic intentions on his part, despite her being married. But his life's chief delight at this time was his collection of angelfish, the name he gave the girls after seeing the real thing in Bermuda, which he called the Aquarium Club. This isn't gossip or speculation. Twain himself was very open about it, writing, "I suppose we are all collectors. As for me, I collect pets, young girls from 10 to 16 years old, girls who are pretty and sweet and naive and innocent. Dear young creatures to whom life is a perfect joy and to whom it has brought no wounds, no bitterness and few tears." He met one in 1907, Dorothy Quick, aged 11, while on a transatlantic crossing to England to collect an honorary doctorate of letters from Oxford University. Others he collected on his frequent trips to Bermuda. His secretary, who amongst her other tasks recorded copies of his letters to his pets, arranged their visits to his house, and acted as chaperone, wrote after one of his Bermuda trips, "He has his aquarium of little girls, and they are all angelfish. Off he goes with a flash when he sees a new pair of slim little legs appear, and if the girl wears butterfly bows of ribbon on the back of her head, then his delirium is complete." He explained his interest as follows: "I experienced a long period of unrest and loneliness. Clara and Jean were busy with their studies and their labours, and I was washing about on a forlorn sea of banquets and speech-making in high and holy causes. I had reached the grandpapa stage of life, and what I lacked and what I needed was grandchildren." Early biographers took this at face value, but in our more suspicious times, this whole period of his life and the 100 or so surviving letters have been subject to intense scrutiny, with some taking the view that his interest was distinctly unhealthy. In 1908, he moved into his last house in Reading, Connecticut, which he named Innocence at Home, declaring, "I have built this house largely, indeed almost chiefly, for the comfort and accommodation of the aquarium." It's hard to know what to make of this obsession, but I think on balance he probably was just lonely and looking for some granddaughterly affection. But in an era where appearance mattered, it certainly raised eyebrows. And when Clara returned from a European concert tour, she was appalled and immediately put an end to the angelfish visits and rechristened the house a distinctly more sober Stormfield. That winter, Twain became more irritable and began to complain about his declining health and spirits. And in 1909 he fired Lyon and wrote a 400-page manuscript in which he brands her a liar, a forger, a thief, a hypocrite, a drunkard, a sneak, a humbug, a traitor, a conspirator, a filthy-minded and salacious slut, pining for seduction. This is another strange incident of his declining years that has baffled scholars ever since. Most have accepted Twain's account. But Laura Trombley, in her book, suggests that Twain's daughter Clara was jealous of her father and Lyon getting close and manufactured the entire scheme to get rid of her and poison her name forever. But whatever the reason, with Lyon gone, his daughter was able to return home from the epilepsy colony in April, and there were no homicidal attacks, although Jean found her father more stubborn and temperamental than usual. But still interested in meeting people and hearing about new technology, and it was after Jean's return home that he had a visit from Thomas Edison, who brought his camera, resulting in the only known footage of Twain and his daughters. He also continued to meet old friends like Helen Keller, whom he had known for years, describing her as the most marvellous person of her sex that has existed on this earth since Joan of Arc. In October 1909, Clara was married in the drawing room at Stormfield to Russian pianist, composer and conductor Osip Gavrilovich, with her father rather unusually wearing his Oxford doctorate gown and hat. But on Christmas Eve there was yet another tragedy. Jean was found dead in her bathtub, having suffered a seizure and drowned. It was the final straw. Twain declared his autobiography finished. He went on a final trip to Bermuda, but suffered increasing chest pains. On returning to Stormfield, he had to be carried in by his butler. He was very weak, clear-minded at times, but confused at others. His speech was slurred, and it is likely that he had a series of strokes. He died with Clara by his side in April 1910. The final words of the man of 1,000 witty aphorisms: goodbye. He was 74. He was buried next to his wife in the family plot at Wardlawn Cemetery in Elmira. His estate was estimated to have been around $500,000, or $11 million today. Clara, as the only one of his children to survive him, was the sole beneficiary. She had a daughter, Nina, who was born 4 months after Twain died. Later in life, Clara occasionally sang on her husband's concert tours and for fundraising concerts for her father's monuments and museum, with which she shared family furnishings and her memories of her famous father. After her husband's death in 1936, Clara married another Russian conductor, Jacques Samosud, and spent her last years living in San Diego, where she died in 1962 at the age of 88. Her daughter Nina died a few years later and had no children, meaning that there were no direct descendants of Samuel Langhorne Clemens. So, what can we conclude about Mark Twain? He was a great writer? Yes. He was a perceptive commentator on society? Definitely. A larger-than-life character that entertained people and continues to entertain them with his carefully crafted words that seem as fresh today as the day they were written. Undoubtedly. But it is very difficult to get beneath the surface of Mark Twain, the performer, the humorist, the clown, to the real Sam Clemens, the boy from Missouri who travelled the world, hobnobbed with royals and presidents and every notable person of the day, but ended up so lonely he collected surrogate granddaughters. His huge body of writing, 37 volumes in one collected edition from the 1920s, is often autobiographical, but always mixed in with a generous seasoning of embellishment and exaggeration. There are the biographies written by others, starting with Albert Bigelow Paine's hagiography, portraying him as some kind of patron saint of literature, which appeared only 2 years after his death in 1912. Many others followed, but it strikes me that new biographies of important figures have to have some new take, something different to say, in order to get published. So I'm always a little suspicious of these radically revisionist interpretations. And then there is the huge industry of Mark Twain scholarship, which generates academic discussions on every aspect of his life and writing, all of which makes it almost impossible to get a balanced sense of Sam Clemens as a person, without devoting your entire life to the intimate examination of his navel fluff. I confess I have not read every article on Twain, or even a fraction of those that have been published, as I think the best way to get a sense of the man is through his writing. And what comes through for me is his warmth, his humanity, his tolerance and respect for others, and his dislike for dogma, rigidity and greed, and fearlessness in criticising what he felt was wrong. Was he a saint? Certainly not, but I don't think he was a monster either. I was keen to know if psychiatrists had added anything of value to Twain's studies over the years, but I wasn't able to find very much. There are the usual mid-century psychoanalytic speculations about Oedipal and castration complexes, which often strike me as saying more about the analyst than the subject they are analysing. This one suggests he experienced psychic trauma during the phallic stage of psychosexual development, and puts this at the root of the corrosive guilt that dominated his later work. I didn't find it very convincing. This is an interesting paper speculating that Twain, the mischievous boy in Hannibal, would meet the inclusion criteria for the modern diagnosis of conduct disorder, first formulated in the 1980s. but it is more a critique of the concept than a serious attempt to explore his behaviour. One recent biographer, Gary Scharnhorst, diagnoses Twain with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder on the basis of his own claim that he was born excited, as well as the memoirs of Twain's fellow journalist and roommate Dan de Quille, who described him as nervously overstrung. Although I'd been wondering about the possibility of ADHD before reading Scharnhorst, I thought the supporting evidence was a little flimsy, and it comes mostly from Twain himself, who, as we know, had a tendency to embellish the facts at times. I think there is little doubt that Twain went through periods of depression, hardly surprising given all the losses and hardships he suffered, but he always managed to pick himself up and return to his work, even if this did gradually become darker and more pessimistic as he got older. None more so than this passage from his autobiography. A myriad of men are born. They labour and sweat and struggle for bread. They squabble and scold and fight. They scramble for little mean advantages over each other. Age creeps up on them. Infirmities follow. Shames and humiliations bring down their prides and their vanities. Those they love are taken from them, and the joy of life is turned to aching grief. The burden of pain, care, misery grows heavier year by year. At length, ambition is dead, pride is dead, vanity is dead, longing for release is in their place. It comes at last, the only unpoisoned gift earth ever had for them, and they vanish from a world where they were of no consequence, where they achieved nothing, where they were a mistake and a failure and a foolishness, where they have left no sign that they have existed, a world which will lament them a day and forget them forever. But another possibility that occurred to me as I read about the changes in his behaviour and questionable judgments towards the end of his life was dementia. We know he had heart disease, was a lifelong smoker, and probably suffered cerebrovascular events in his final few days. Could vascular dementia go some way to explaining his wandering across the street in London in 1907, wearing only a bathrobe and slippers? His general grumpiness and irritability, his sudden sacking and condemnation of his secretary, and the, however you look at it, strange obsession with his Angelfish girls. It's more of a question than a definite diagnosis. Ron Power's otherwise excellent biography that I've relied on for much of this presentation goes unusually silent in this period of his life. And other sources have problems of contradiction and overinterpretation. But I think there is at least some evidence that the great mind of Mark Twain, the mind that produced 37 volumes of writing and some of the best-loved characters of American literature, was beginning to get clouded towards the end. But I'll finish with the more familiar Mark Twain, the clever, witty Mark Twain. Age is an issue of mind over matter. If you don't mind, it doesn't matter. And, as an academic, my personal favourite. Get your facts first, then you can distort them as you please. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed that. If so, please check out my videos on other writers and poets, or change it up and have a dabble with some of the artists I've covered. As always, I'd love to hear your views and opinions and suggestions for who to cover next. And remember to subscribe and click for notifications if you haven't already done so, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye for now.